Hi everyone. Okay, so this is our little presentation on risks versus hazard, in particular flooding risks and flooding hazards. So first I want to talk about the differences between risks and hazard because these two somewhat get associated together, but really they're different. They're kind of cousins of each other. So we're going to start with hazards. So hazards are the activity or the action that present risk. And so these are the things that actually cause risk to happen. So if you take a class in a department called natural hazards, then you might be learning about things like volcanoes. You might be learning about things like hurricanes or earthquakes or, I don't know, tsunamis. Or, hey, the topic of this lecture, flooding. So those are hazards. Driving is a hazard. Skydiving is a hazard. All those kind of things are hazard. They present risk. So they are the action that actually presents a bit of risk. And really anything could present a little bit of risk given what it is in the situation. I mean, walking down the street presents a little bit of a hazard, right? You're on a street with traffic. So those then present risk. But hazard is the action itself. Okay, so that's hazard. Then risk. Risk has two components. And these components can be thought of as kind of synonyms. So we got one is the idea of how frequently it occurs. So it's an idea of frequency, spell Josh, frequency, or the probability, or the chance, or percentage, some idea of how frequently or likely it is to occur. That's another one. So that's one aspect of risk. And the other aspect of risk then is this idea of if it happens, how bad is it? So it's an idea of the damage or the cost, or let's see, it could be injuries if you're in people, it could be deaths, some idea of how bad is it. So this first component up here is how likely is it to happen? Is it common? Is it rare? What is it? And then the second is if something bad happens, what is going to happen? So, for instance, there are things that have a high frequency of occurring. Like I said, driving. Most people drive quite often, and so they might have a high frequency of driving. The event then that happens if there is an action would be the damage, the cost, the injuries, and deaths, like a car accident. And so what you take is you take this idea of the frequency and you multiply it by this idea of the damage. And that's what gives you the risk. So risk is then this idea of frequency times damage equals the risk. This is how companies calculate things like car insurance or health insurance. They take the frequency, this idea of what's the chance that something's going to happen. And if something does happen, how much damage is going to be occur. So this is how car insurance is calculated. They calculate the frequency of an accident that's going to happen based on all kinds of factors like your age or gender or even how good of a student you are. They based things on grades. They based things on marriage. My rates went down when I got married. Women get less accidents than men. So they base all these kind of rates based on that. Damage then, so if you drive a really expensive car, I don't know, some Ferrari or something, if that gets in an accident, that's going to be much more expensive to replace than some 20-year-old Honda. And hey, I had a 20-year-old Honda, so nothing against those, but they cost a lot less than Ferraris. So this idea of frequency times the damage gives us our risk. Now, when it comes to this idea of risk and hazard, so we've got risk and we've got hazard. Which one of these two do you think you have more control over? Do you have more control over hazards or do we have more control over risks? Well, typically, we have way more control over risks. We can do things to minimize the risk that we take. If we go back to this idea of the car accident, well, if we want to minimize the risk presented from a car accident, we can do things like drive more slowly, drive during the daytime, use seat belts, oh, use your headlights, use your turn signals, do all those kind of things, don't speed, all those kind of things that go along and try and minimize that kind of risk. So you're trying to actually change that risk. Now, when it comes to flooding,